so much you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time.
Welcome to Is It Bad for the Economy? My name is Kobi Tirey. I'm a Democratic media consultant trying to figure out how the Democratic Party can once again become the party of economic prosperity and mobility. And I'm joined by Banker Bill, a very serious, a very well-credentialed, a very independent voting banker. Today's topic is housing. And look, I don't need to wait for Banker Bill to say it. Trump has been terrible for housing. Whether it's been the tariffs he's imposed, whether it's by reducing the labor supply with his deportations and by having ICE go raid Home Depots for illegal immigrants or potentially American citizens. And he certainly hasn't done anything that would inspire the confidence that the Fed needs in the economy to lower interest rates, both with the tariffs and with the big, beautiful bill increasing the deficit as much as it does. But the issue is not on the federal level. I wish it was. I wish this was an issue where the Democrats have been great for 30 years and the Republicans have been screwing it all up. But on this issue, Democrats and Republicans have both been screwing it up a great deal, not on the federal level, not even on the state level, but on the local level, where on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, a community by community level. In the United States, individuals have more power to stop housing developments than they do probably in any other country in the world. We all know that the cost of housing is getting way too high. Responsibly, we're not supposed to spend more than 30% of our income on rent or our mortgage, but more and more and more families are getting pushed over that line. Banker Bill, in our college loan episode, we talked about how the problem wasn't so much the amount of debt, but the lack of income that was being generated by those who'd made that investment in their education in the first place. I wanted to ask a similar question here about housing. Is the problem really that housing is getting too expensive, or is it simply that our incomes aren't rising proportionally to be able to cover that cost?
I think it's the opposite. So from what we had. So this is a supply-driven problem rather than demand. And in the college stuff, a lot of the demand is driven by socioeconomics and easy access to credit. And in the case of housing, you have basically in many areas nationwide, especially anywhere near a nice body of water, it is prohibitive. There's not enough supply for housing. Not enough.
You know, one of the major trends of this era of these increased housing costs is that more and more folks are renting later and later into their lives. Fewer and fewer Americans will ever become homeowners. Before we dig into the reasons for that and what politicians should be doing on every level to increase the housing supply and to bring those costs down, do you see this problem of more renters, less owners as being a macroeconomic problem that's going to dampen our economic growth on the national level?
I do, based on the spending habits of typical Americans. So, the average American savings rate is like 5 or 6%. The American consumer is probably the greatest consumer in the world. Take a look at China, which is at least a near peer in terms of GDP. And their savings rate is much higher. In some cases, depending on different estimates, 30 to 50%. A lot of different reasons behind that, lack of social safety net, different things in China. But I use that to exemplify the point of Americans are consumers. And you may have seen statistics that by and large, homeowners have a lot more net worth over time than renters. And that isn't because it's just you own a home and someone else rents. Unfortunately, it appears that folks who rent, they underinvest elsewhere. So they're just spending the money. They're consuming. They're not investing in, say, the stock market. They're not investing into housing in other ways. Whereas it is true to an extent that a home buyer, someone who buys a house, does have a little bit of a forced savings by way of paying off this mortgage so that they own this asset. One of the many reasons in which housing has become unaffordable and there's a lack of supply is this belief of the American public of housing as an investment and as a savings vehicle.
That definitely makes a lot of sense to me if you look at the last 30, 40 years. However, recently, especially since the pandemic, especially since rates went back up, as I've been talking to my friends, my personal network about their finances, about their decisions to own versus rent, I've heard a couple of times folks say, now, I did the numbers with my financial advisor, and we actually decided that if I put away X amount of money a month into my retirement portfolio, I'll actually have more money at the end of the day for my retirement than if we bought a house now because of what interest rates are. Now, I always take those kinds of things with a grain of salt, but could there be some truth to that? Is that maybe less true now than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll generalize for you. So the current mortgage rate, I think, is around 6.5%, 7%. Stabilized real estate in the United States. So, if you don't buy in a hot area, you buy in any area that's not hot. Any other, it doesn't have to be an area that's going down, but just a stable area. You're typically going to get housing appreciation of about 3% per year compounded. So every year, your house is going to be worth 3% more than it was last year. If you say the inflation rate is 2%, then your real return on the house every year compounded is 1%. Now what's happening is you have to pay 6.5%. So you're paying 6.5% nominally on something that's only going to return you maybe 3.5%, let's say. So there's that. That's an issue. Secondarily, you as a homeowner are buying at today's rates. Whereas if you're a renter, you're probably renting at yesterday's rates or maybe 5 years ago rates or 10 years ago rates. What do I mean by that? So you have somebody, mom and pop kind of landlord, make it simple, and they own a few houses and they bought in like 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017, and they've secured low interest rates. Maybe they even bought in 2021. You as a renter may be benefiting from that because their costs to operate that rental you live in are lower than if you bought a house today. So sure, there's myriad ways in which housing may not be the best way to accumulate wealth over time. Ultimately, my perspective, and I understand I may be out of step on this, housing to me is a consumption asset. The only thing as part of a piece of property that appreciates is the land itself. Everything else on that piece of property, whether it's your pool or your kitchen cabinets, your toilet, your carpet, all depreciates over time. You're either going to have to replace it or you will replace it because it's dated. So in that way, it's depreciating. It's not growing. You're constantly updating, constantly consuming this asset.
I don't want to go into it too much because at the end of the day, this is a podcast about the American economy. But one narrative that came up as we were doing research for this is that this problem seems to be at least much worse in English-speaking countries. And it's not because we speak English. It's because these are countries where housing is seen as an important investment asset. It is seen as an important retirement savings asset. Do you buy into this narrative that if we all didn't think about our houses as a investment for retirement, but thought of it purely as just consumption, that there wouldn't be these barriers to building that we're going to get into here in a little bit?
Yes, I do think that's happening. We see that happening in communities. It's happening in my community, maybe happening in those who's listening to this. I think it's happening nationwide, where you have communities that maybe buy land or authorize their township or their city council to buy land for the purpose of making it preserve space. To me, you are allowing your municipality, by voting for that, to speculate on land. On the piece about English-speaking countries, that's interesting. You had sent me that. It was a couple years ago from the Financial Times, that report. Yeah, there's probably something to that. It was interesting that a lot of those are, yes, they're English-speaking, but they're also Protestant countries. So is there something to the old adage, 400 or 500 years old, of a man's house is his castle? And that puts a strain on further development and supply. Ultimately, I don't know. We need supply of housing. Okay, there needs to be more houses built, right, in the places that people want to live. And if we're preventing that for purely a reason to increase the price of my house or your house or existing homeowners, we're going to eventually reach some kind of societal breaking point.
To me, the sort of English speaking versus non-English speaking part, the most interesting part of that to me is you always hear about, oh, you could buy this house in Italy for $25. You can buy this house in rural Japan for $5,000 if you agree to, build it up so much. That's because those are countries where that real estate is not expected to appreciate in any sort of meaningful way.
You got it. Look at you picking up market dynamics.
Before we get into the supply side, though, I do want to ask one question, one thing we've been hearing a lot about, especially since the pandemic, that there are simply too many homes, too many apartments that are currently vacant because they are investment properties. Folks bought them, whether it's for an Airbnb or just to sit on them because we know real estate has been traditionally such a good investment in this country, or maybe they're just vacation homes, things like that. A lot of cities are looking at turning the commercial office buildings downtown into apartment buildings. Is there enough open real estate, vacant real estate out there to house everybody? Or are we going to have to really build ourselves out of this problem?
Look, on the Airbnb front or like vacant rentals, I don't know that I would agree with that per se, because look, fundamentally, housing has a high holding cost. You've got to pay property taxes. You got to keep all the utilities on at all times. You got to maintain it and keep it desirable if you expect it to be rented at top dollar. That's another thing too. If you want top dollar for your rental, you need to have a top dollar rental then. I think there's probably many reasons for those vacancies. There's always going to be some number of properties that are vacant for whatever reason. I don't know what that number is, that minimum structural rate. But I would generally say if someone that owns housing who is seeking to make money on that house and cash flow that house on a month-to-month basis, or that property, whatever it is, they're going to do so. They're certainly not going to take a loss on that if they don't have to. And if they are, that is for probably a rare strategic reason.
That makes a lot of sense to me. But at the same time, you hear these crazy stats like that there's 28 vacant homes for every homeless person in the United States.
I saw one that did research on it and found that they were counting these quote unquote houses. They were just counting properties. So they were counting basically a piece of land that had a mailbox. So it has an address. So how many is that? I mean, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
But at the same time, is this an efficiency problem? Would it be easier for us to say we need to be using the housing that we currently have better? Or is it really just go build, build, build?
It's both, right? I mean, if you look at high density markets, and New York's an easy one, it's in the media, but so many of these markets have experienced growth and have supply shortages, especially South, West, West Coast, Pacific Northwest, whatever you have it. You're looking at not only zoning, but also building. So there's classic upzoning. And then there's also just build sprawl, right? And so we've reached a point in some of these areas where they did initially build up, then they've built out, and now they are kind of refusing to build up again in the center city or the highest density areas. You see that, again, in New York, 2nd Avenue subway. They spent billions of dollars on that project. As they spent on that project and as it got approved, they didn't correspondingly upzone residential areas along that new route. Now you've got the new mayoral candidate over there who's talking about, hey, we need to do that. Great. That'd be certainly a good start, a policy I would agree with. But I think it would be both. It's not just, hey, let the developers in there and build everything up. No, but you need to have cognizant work with developers, with the municipalities to improve the zoning density, the population density, while building habitats, that's what they are, that people want to live in. People want a nice little place to live. There's all these houses, there's houses down south, Kobe, okay? The west coast of Florida between Tampa and Fort Myers that were built in the last couple years. They're 3 beds, 2 baths, 1,800 square feet. They have a pool. It's $550,000. We should be able to build that house all over the country. 3 beds, 2 baths. Instead, what you get in the Northeast are these monster houses, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 square feet that are new construction. They're over $1 million, and everybody's incentivized to it. The builder wants it. The tax assessor's office wants it. The town council wants it. The NIMBYs want it, because as soon as you mention affordable to any NIMBY, they think that's a bad thing. Right. So they want some house that they probably themselves couldn't afford. So it's not just let the building go or all we need to do is zone up. No, it's both.
One thing that's so curious to me about that example that you just listed is the Florida versus Northeast example is that Florida, as anybody who's from that state now knows, you almost can't get home insurance in Florida anymore. In certain parts of the state, you absolutely can't. You're seeing that become more and more of an issue in other places that are affected a lot by climate change, especially Arizona and California. Is it really just NIMBYism that's keeping those homes from being built in more habitable parts of the country? Or are there some sort of economic incentives here that are really pushing all of this affordable housing into places that can't sustain the people on an environmental level?
I think for the most part, the NIMBYs are doing it for economic reasons. I think it is both north, south, east, and west for economic reasons. Places in Florida, yes, the cost of insurance, especially flood insurance, has risen dramatically. Yet still, there are municipalities like the one I'm referencing in Sarasota County where you don't need flood insurance, and the houses there aren't a flood risk. The economics of it is those municipalities in Florida or the South where you see a lot of building and development, They are trying to increase their tax base. They are trying to grow. Places in the Northeast have already grown. They're not in the same spot. So in the Northeast, it's much more a matter of, if we upzone, what are we upzoning into? What's the tax assessed value of what we're upzoning into? Same thing of the house that I described. These $1 million, 3,000 square foot houses that are being built for new construction, where families now are 2 and 1, or if you're lucky, it's 2 and 2, right? I mean, 2 adults and 2 children. And in those areas especially in the Northeast, it's about the fixed costs to even start construction, impact assessments, permits, all the legal stuff, plus the labor, plus the demand for the housing, and your tax base for the municipality. So I think that all of those sum up to economic reasons. I have my doubts that there are many quote unquote NIMBYs who are NIMBYs for the sake of being a NIMBY. And I think a lot of it is driven by people's wallets rather than purely, I don't want more housing.
Before we go all in on the NIMBYs, I do want to spend a second talking about the builders. Harris and her housing policy really focused on the builders instead of sort of pushing incentives down to the states and the cities to do more housing. Instead of giving tax incentives to homeowners and renters, she tried to give tax credits to the builders to build affordable housing and multifamily housing. And part of the reason for that is this idea that we had a glut in housing. The Great Recession happened. All the home builders really started tightening their bootstraps, and now we have this glut. That story makes a lot of sense to me, but it also seems overly simplistic. It doesn't feel like this housing issue just magically appeared since 2008. Are the problems that we're experiencing now really so directly tied to the 2008 recession? And what did you think of these policy ideas from Harris?
So we've experienced in the United States, we've experienced this problem of not enough housing before. We solved this 2 generations ago now by moving to the suburbs, right, and expanding straight out geographically rather than building up, right? So you had people that made sacrifices by way of, hey, I got a house I can afford. It's a bigger house than something I could ever afford in the city. I also have a yard. The sacrifice I'm making is I'm going to have to commute an hour plus every day into the city. But you know what? It's worth it. And I got this thing and it's mine. Fast forward, you have the concept that housing as an investment, housing as a wealth vehicle. From 1981 through 2000 and almost 22, straight line down in interest rates. Every few years, if you bought a house, you'd be able to refinance that at a lower rate. So you were perceiving yourself making out like a bandit. 2008 happens. There was speculation by the builders. A lot of the builders got wiped out, or if they weren't wiped out, they were nearly wiped out. They found religion. They don't overbuild anymore. They're running businesses. They're running reasonable profit margins. Real estate and builders in particular are not a significant proportion of, let's say, the total stock market, not just the S&P 500, the total stock market. Okay, so you had reduced building post 2008. You get into 2019, 2020. The peak of the millennials are now turning 30, 31. I think peak millennials like 1989 to 1992, 93. They're all turning to home buying age. Massive demand for housing. For the last decade, you underbuilt housing. Now you have a problem. I'm not some apologist for builders in any way, but they are running a business, and they are not speculating and running up building houses, waiting for them to sell, in advance. They've gotten much more strategic and particular on the way they model out returns, on the way they model out demographic changes, and looking to build where the people are and when they're coming, not before. But I mean, can I say that the builder should have got a tax break? I don't know. I think we should be looking for market ways that are not tax breaks, that are not incentives, that would otherwise entice builders to build. And that would be things like permitting. States could issue municipal bonds to bring in the utilities instead of putting the utilities on the hook of the builder, right? So, hey, we're going to build this new development. It's going to be 100 houses, whatever it is. The target house is 6x median income of the zip code, and the municipality or the state is going to issue a municipal bond backed by the tax dollars of that zip code or of the state, and they're going to bring in the water, power, sewer, the roads. You take that all off the builder's plate, right? I think that's an example that could work.
Well, if only we had a president who was committed to investing in rural broadband. A friend of ours mentioned an acronym that I hadn't heard before. in a text thread we had about housing, and that was bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And based on some of the meetings that I've gone to in my communities, that's just completely true. Anybody who's already bought into the housing market wants to make sure they're doing everything they can to protect their investment. They don't want any homeless shelters. They don't want any apartment buildings. They don't want any more cars. They don't want any businesses that are going to bring any more cars. And part of me gets that. But at the same time, we all need more housing in order for our entire economy to work for everyone. And one example that really, really stuck out to me, Minneapolis, they tried to address the zoning laws, one of the things that you mentioned. They got rid of all single family zones. So if you were a single family housing neighborhood before, now small to medium apartment buildings could be built in those neighborhoods. So the builders got ready, they had their proposals, they worked together with the city government to make it happen. And then when they got to building, all of a sudden the local groups came in and they used every trick in the book to stall. Some of it was historic, some of it was procedural, some of it was environmental. And of course, the second there was pressure on that little local level, the state and the city politicians weren't backing it nearly as aggressively as they had when they were passing initial legislation. We all recognize this story. I think we all need to find it in ourselves not to be that person. But maybe this will help. One of the builders in one of the pieces that I was reading about this Minneapolis example stated that at the end of the day, the building got built, but there was a huge increase in cost because of this process. And that was that he had to spend a lot of time and a lot of money hiring local lawyers and local lobbyists to actually go to all these community meetings to fight for their proposal, to demonstrate that it was in line with the city legislation. So if you want to make sure that your dollar stays out of my pocket, stays out of lobbyists and political consultants' pockets, let's have less local meetings about affordable housing developments and just let them happen already.
Yeah, I mean that gets to the heart of the matter. You know, where you're seeing the rapid increase in population in these states, or where the CNBC came out this week with the states easiest to do business, and they're the same states where population's growing the most. And you look at what they're doing there, and they're rapidly approving things and making sure that the utilities and the roads and the infrastructure is getting built. Sure, there's people that don't like it, but there's a model for it, you know, that cuts through the red tape. I mean, in your instance, I hadn't heard about this. They actually did try to cut through the red tape. And my perception would be state law would supersede anything at the local level. And still, there was this abomination of endless meetings that put money into consultants' pockets that ultimately raised the cost of what was being built.
Folks who study this stuff on how to build up countries will not work in the United States because there is no country where a local historical society can get together with a pond preservation organization and completely block the will of the state legislature. Is there any economic rationale behind this, behind just everybody protecting their investment? Do we just need to get rid of these groups across the board if we want to reinvigorate growth, especially from young people, from folks at the lower end of the economic ladder in these cities that we're all cramming into?
Look, I think these problems are our own. And if we want to solve them, the answers are right in front of us. You need to increase supply so that people can afford to live. You see, there was the recent union deal in Philadelphia this week where Philadelphia, which I do agree with, has a mandate that if you work for the sanitation department, or myriad departments that are associated with Philadelphia government, you have to live in Philadelphia. Hey, I love the concept of work where you live. Right? Support the community if you're working in government where you live. You don't want, someone coming from 3 counties over. What do they care about where they're working, right? Great. The problem is they can't afford to live there on their pay. That's terrible. We can't have that. And it's not just about, just pay them more. No, you need to attack the problem that is supply. And I think what you will find often is these NIMBYism, or the folks that subscribe to that kind of a doctrine, they're oftentimes the same people that are at the heads of your zoning hearing boards or your historical societies, where you get sued and they gum up development and you can't get anything done. And I think it's interesting that these communities are very aware of the value of their real estate, and yet don't recognize that that value in the real estate is derived from people who want to live there. And as long as people want to live there, that's great. The asset, the house will continue to pay off for you, right? But if anything occurs where for whatever reason you're no longer a demanding place to live in, you will see the value in that real estate evaporate. And I don't think that's appreciated, right? So this idea that, if we build housing, it's going to reduce the value of my house or your house. That's a common trope that's told. I think it's a scare tactic. It's often not true. These single family houses are not competing with, say, townhomes or small apartment complexes, right? It's a totally different market.
So, we can complain about that all we want, but I think if we're trying to change it, if we want to change ourselves in that regard, I think there's kind of two different levels of this. And one of them I really don't like. As somebody who got into democratic politics because I truly fundamentally do believe in democracy, in local input, it sucks that people getting involved on the local level, the people who have the biggest interest in their local communities thriving, are the problem in this situation.
Yeah, I think it is. It is purely local, and people need to be more involved in local politics and not just take an interest every 4 years in national politics.
Yeah, I think one thing is that if you have the opportunity to go to a neighborhood meeting, a local town committee meeting, that sort of thing, and stand up.
You should go and see just sit there, just sit in the back and see how ridiculous these things are. The stuff that people say. I've seen it in my own community where they're trying to build a water treatment plant. And because the water treatment plant is a quarter mile away from this row of houses, they're all opposed to it because it's supposedly going to, decrease their property values, supposedly. And they'll find any number of experts and pay money and tie up hearings and bring lawyers and everything else. Please go. I encourage, especially the people that are impacted by this. They are local. They are living in these areas. They're renting there. They're registered voters in the zip code. They should be involved. And I know it's difficult, but just go. You might even make friends.
I think it's so important. And I think one of the problems is that the folks who go to these meetings in and out are the seniors who are retired, who have the time, who are the most invested, both emotionally and fiscally, in the neighborhood never changing, who have less of an understanding of how much easier it was for them to buy a home in this neighborhood when they were coming up, as opposed to the folks coming up now. But I think, just to get to your point, a really relevant example right now is these clips just came out of 3-4 years ago, the folks down in the hill country of Texas going on and on and on about how they didn't want Joe Biden's money for a flood emergency prevention system because he was a socialist. And you're watching these clips of people saying taking Joe Biden's money means that we're culpable in demonic communism. And the thing is, I love the hill country of Texas. I went to one of those boys' Christian camps in the area as a kid. I do not want to be sensational or opportunistic about this crisis, but don't get tricked into getting hysterical and defensive in local politics. That's in fact the time where, if we just take a breath and listen and try to understand the other side, because they're in the room with you, you might actually come to an agreement. But, at the same time, I do think this is an issue where the state needs to exercise more control, simply because if you are having a meeting about should an apartment building be built in a specific community, the people who are going to go to that meeting are the people who already live in that community. The folks who would potentially move into that community, would potentially benefit. The pro side of the argument is completely eliminated from the process. And we can't magically go round those people up and say, you're going to live here in 3 years, so could you please speak up at this town council meeting? I think we do need a sort of system where we deal with this on the city level, on the state level, so that we can address a city level need, a state level need, without giving communities local control. Because at the end of the day, I love community control. I love people getting involved, but this is just a conversation where the pro side of the argument, it's impossible for them to show.
Look, states have an obligation to make their cities livable, if for no other reason than their cities are oftentimes their economic drivers that drive their credit rating, which drives the cost of their municipal bonds, their pension fund allocations, et cetera. Yeah, you mentioned a tragic thing. I mean, the sirens that they had, they were $36,000 each installed. You put them at the firehouse, you press a button electronically, they go off. What if you had these flood sirens anywhere? Would that impact the insurance rate, right, as a preventative control? Yeah, to disregard that for the sake of, I guess you said whatever it was. We didn't want to hear socials. I didn't see that. I saw the stuff where they were, I don't want to get into it. Look, the point is, folks, it was $36,000 per siren to install these flood sirens And they said no. And they will wonder why the cost of flood insurance goes up. And they'll be frustrated and they'll look for their government to provide a solution when the solution's right in front of them and they fail to act on it. It's the fact. I hate to call people out, but that's it.
And it's an extreme example, but again, I want to be really fair on this issue. The time issue, the pro side of the argument issue, that isn't there. That's a structural problem that needs to be addressed. But we are part of the problem here, and I think that in
by lack of involvement for the most part.
No, but that yes, but there is also the part of people getting hysterical, and the example we listed is a partisan example, but there are plenty of examples of liberals getting hysterical about progressive causes or environmental causes.
California, since what, 1970, when Reagan wrote the Environmental Act, that for now the last 20 years people use as a way to gum up development, and now California just rolled a lot of it. Well, I shouldn't say rolled a lot of it back, but made it much easier to develop. Basically, if this was already zoned for residential, you can basically do whatever you want, right? The kind of almost like the Minneapolis thing you described.
There are times when we want to legislate our values, and there are times when we want to address problems that are before us. And what happens a lot of the times is that somebody sits down and says, I want to do something about the fact that small developers are getting run out of town by big developers. I want to do something about the fact that too many of the developers that have relationships with the city are politically connected, are not diverse enough. I really care about the environment, and I'm just looking for the closest lever that I have to pull to do something that I can tell myself is pro-environmental. And that's the spirit that gets so many of us into politics. We have something we're passionate about, and we look for the closest lever to pull. But the problem is there's a procedural price for that. There's an administrative price for that. That comes down the road when you're actually trying to solve the problem, and all of a sudden you don't get just to solve the problem with the tools and the partners that you have accessible to you at the time. You have this baggage of 12 years of people finding that the only place that they could inject their value was in regulating how their local community does business. And I think that we really, really need to take a step back on the left and on the right, whether we're liberals trying to protect the bees or whether we're worried about demonic socialism. We need to really think about, am I pulling this lever right now because it's the only lever I feel I have to actualize my values, or because this is going to make my community a better place? And that's so hard to do. But if you believe, like Banker Bill and I do, that we need to step off of this partisan cliff and we need to bring common sense back into it, common sense doesn't mean I'm right when I feel like I'm right and I don't have to listen to any criticism. Common sense means, when are we doing things based on the numbers, and when are we doing things based on our values? And this is just one of those situations where we're loading up a spreadsheet issue. How much should development cost? How much should they spend on environmental reviews? How much does the historical vibe of this neighborhood really contribute, versus just saying, I think things are too commercial. Hey, if I go to this town council meeting and scream long enough, I can keep commercial developers out of my neighborhood. That's a political sin we're all susceptible to. The more involved we get, the more susceptible we are to it. So I think, I just value issues, spreadsheet issues. We have to get better at figuring out when it's time to do either one based on what's actually going to generate real results.
This is my struggle, is this issue of folks electing political beliefs that are not in their economic best interest.
One last question I have for you. I was a little confused about this. I haven't had a chance to look into it too much. Apparently, there's a new Trump policy that your rent payments can now go towards qualifying you for your mortgage.
As in terms of evaluating your creditworthiness?
I guess.
Some companies have done that forever. I think that's fair. It's the mom and pop landlords or smaller landlords that weren't reporting or do not report rent payments to credit bureaus, but there are large national operators and even smaller than national, regional operators, super regionals, who, as a way of incentivizing you to sign with them, are reporting your on-time rent payments to credit bureaus. Sure, I would support that. Who wouldn't? You're making on-time payments. How's that any different from paying off your car? Or if you're leasing a car, right? You rent the car. If you're leasing it, you're renting it. So if that gets reported, why shouldn't your lease payments? It shows your credit worthiness.
So you're saying that a lot of folks were already including your rent?
I don't know that it's a lot, but I know for a fact that national and even smaller super regional or regional firms who run apartments have been for years reporting on-time payments to credit bureaus.
Now, let's say that's a small percentage. Let's say all of a sudden renters do get this added to their credit history. Would you expect credit scores to go up so much that there's a little bump in home buying, or would you expect this to be pretty marginal?
Well, my understanding as a general matter is that overall credit scores are near all-time highs. So I don't think you would see a further bump beyond at a general level what's out there. Would it help certain individuals? Absolutely. And it should. They deserve credit for on-time payments. I mean, so what? It's legislation, or are they making it easier to do it? Because it's weird that it would be like, what? You're making an executive order, but great. People are already doing it. Companies are already doing it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to Is It Bad for the Economy? We hope you are safely and warmly or maybe coolly housed right now. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, please, please give us that 5-star review. Leave a comment for us on Spotify. Share this podcast with your family and friends. Sign up for email updates on isitbadfortheeconomy.com. We'll be coming at you again in 2 weeks with a whole new topic. But housing, good for the economy. We should get more of it.
Hey, that house you referred to, that's $50,000 you can buy in Italy, doesn't have AC.
It does not.
You're gonna win so much, you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time